everyone. Um, Welcome to our Why Family Historians Need to Tell Their Stories program. I'm here with Laura Hedgecock. She is a family history researcher and writer of the book Memories and Me. I will turn it over to Laura. There you go.
Okay. And then, hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just looking to find my PowerPoint. Oops. I think I did something wrong, Jade. Okay, now I'm good. I'm ready to go.
I'm going to mention one more thing. Laura's handouts for her slideshow are in the comments. Just added that now for everyone.
All right. Thank you, Jade. I appreciate the help with the technology.
No problem.
And good evening, everyone else. I'm coming to you from my kitchen in Farmington Hills to talk about why family historians need to tell family stories. And I'm going to start explaining that by telling a story of my own. Once upon a time, a couple of years ago actually, on a summer Sunday afternoon, I looked out my kitchen window and I saw two birds fighting on the driveway. It wasn't your normal territorial flapping of wings and chirping. It was a rolling around, feathers flying, ugly fight between two nuthatches. If you're not familiar with nuthatches, they are small bluish birds, and they're fairly common here in Michigan. They're cute. They have a subtle beauty with little pointed beaks. If you've ever seen a little blue and white bird coming down a tree trunk head first, that's probably a nuthatch. So back to my story. Saw the birds fighting and I ran outside, which broke up the tuss-up. One bird flew away and sat up on the edge of my porch roof. The other one lay off kilter on the driveway. One wing spread out, looking quite a bit worse for wear. I watched it, looked at it, not sure if it was going to be able to recover. While I was watching, the second nuthatch flew down from the roof and delivered one last brutal peck at the injured bird, turning it back over on its belly. Well, I started swinging my arms and I yelled something coherent like, "Hey, you, leave him alone." My husband must have been watching too, because he came out with a graham cracker box that he had fashioned into a tent. He said to me, "Here, take this and put it over him. Maybe he'll, with a little chance, with a little protection, maybe he'll recover." So I did that. And we went back and looked out of the kitchen window and watched him for about 20 minutes. It took that long for him to get his feet underneath him just a little bit. Another 20 minutes went by and I went out to talk to him. You know, the things that you say to an injured bird. "Sorry this happened to you. I wish I knew how to help you." He got on his or her feet and looked at me, then took a little hop outside of his graham cracker tent towards me. I was so flattered, thinking maybe he knew I meant him no harm. He or she was starting to look a little better, but had a wound at the base of his beak and probably from the other bird's final peck, and he had missing some feathers on his head. Another half an hour went by and the temperature started to drop. So I consulted a local animal rescue in Howell, Michigan, about what the best thing to do was. And they advised that you put the injured animal in a warm, dark place. So I found a shoebox and I poked holes in it, and I went back out, thinking the bird could overnight in the shoebox in our powder room. As I approached him, I tried to coo and be gentle and telling it not to worry, but it had come to its senses enough to be totally alarmed at the approach of a human. And in a frantic flutter, it flew off to a nearby tree. What a relief. That evening, I kept checking just to make sure the bird wasn't laying in the yard somewhere. And I said to my husband at least 10 times, I'm so happy we didn't have to watch that little bird die. I'm so happy we didn't have to figure out what to do. And I think he was relieved that we weren't trekking out to Howell for a bird rescue. I had texted friends with a what to do, and so now I texted them with the good news. Smiley faces and hearts were exchanged all around. So the next day, we saw the little nuthatch on our feeder. Missing a few feathers on his head and a wound at his beak, we knew he was our little bird. So for weeks afterwards, every time I went outside, I'd look up at the trees, wondering if he was any of the little nuthatches flittering around. My little nuthatch. Suddenly, I cared about a little average common bird. And maybe listening to me today, realizing that that little bird had come to have meaning to me, perhaps you cared just a little about a random bird in Farmington Hills. That's really what we want to do with the research we do on our ancestors and the family stories that we have. We want to write and share stories that will connect the readers to us, our family history, and our ancestors. We don't want people to think of John Smith. We want our readers to think of my John Smith, my great uncle. So think about what your stories of your forebears can do for your family as you share them, as you show them how they were important to you, as they were important to your family. So stories, we all know, are more engaging and enlightening than simple names and dates. Stories can transport us to different times and different places. And that's fine. That is part of genealogy. Even though the research centers around the facts, genealogy is more than the simple facts. We're looking for the hows, the whys, the what happened, right? And this in the picture is my big sister reading to me when I was little. One example I have of this is the two names that you see on the screen and the facts below them. These are my maternal great-great-grandfather on the left and my paternal great-great-grandfather on the right. Obviously, I've never met either of them, and I only know them from the records they left behind. I have a single photo of Van Buren Field Clark, none of Thomas Duniway. According to the research, they lived similar lives. They lived in similar times. Both were farmers. Both were poor farmers. Both served as privates in the Confederate Army. There's similar records available for both of them. So the paper trail gives me two not very different men. However, I feel much more connected to my maternal great-great-grandpa. Why is that? My grandmother, Hazel Crimes, wrote down stories about her grandpa. She passed down some of his war stories, which are interesting, though totally unconfirmed at this point, especially the one about how he had the drop on a Union soldier and chose not to take it, and how the soldier repaid the favor on a subsequent occasion. She tells us that he and that other soldiers corresponded with each other throughout the rest of their lives, and the other soldier actually came to visit. But even more importantly than that, through her stories, I know that despite being a soldier, my great-great-grandpa was a gentle person, an animal lover, and a man of deep faith. I also know that he and his wife took grandma in and raised her after her father abandoned her about age 12. I know he was a loving, invested grandpa. In other words, because I can look back at my great-great-grandpa through his granddaughter's eyes, even adoring eyes, the stories of him resonate with me. And that's what we want. We want to write stories about our family members and our ancestors that can connect emotionally and connect intellectually. But sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, we overlook the most obvious way of helping our loved ones connect with our family stories or even our own stories. We, like the family photographer, forget to put ourselves in the frame. This is something I know quite well. My mom was an out and out camera bug, not necessarily a photographer with all the expertise and forethought that implies. She snapped photos, left and right, a lot of them. But sadly, we have relatively few pictures of her, particularly from the 60s and 70s, when my sister and I were too young to be doing any picture taking of our own. But even in the 80s and 90s, up until the birth of my children, she was in very few pictures. And from a genealogical standpoint, that makes no sense. We don't start our pedigree sheets with anonymous genealogist, unless it's an online tree, but that's a totally different subject. And you know where I'm going with that. We start with stating our facts. Why don't we start with telling our own stories and sharing our own memories of the people that we love, our family? In my mom's case, it was only when she had grandchildren, something that she was only able to enjoy for 4 years of her life, did she want to be in the shot. I get that it was her prerogative, but it really is a loss for the rest of the family. It's not always easy putting your heart on your sleeve. The photographer analogy works really well for me. Like my mother, I've never enjoyed seeing photos of myself. And this photo on your screen is no different. I don't really like it. But I love that I preserved the moment when my goofy son graduated from 8th grade. There's a reason our first diaries come with a lock and key. For most of us, sharing the more vulnerable side, let alone our most personal thoughts and stories, doesn't come naturally. It's a little harder. But when you start putting your own feelings, even about someone else, into the story, it makes it more compelling for readers. So some great places to start when you're writing about your family members or relatives or ancestors is to include your own feelings about them as you write. What kind of relationship did you have? How did you feel about them? And how did that change through your life? Telling your stories from your heart is the best way to connect your family and readers to the people you're writing about. As a writer, we would call them characters, even though they're real people. But that is the best way to bring these characters to life. Here's some advice that I thought was super good from the Toastmasters magazine back in 2016. The emotions are your experience and the bridge that helps listeners step into your story and connect with your journey. Don't just tell what happened. Speak about how it made you feel. Because it's Toastmasters, they say speak about, I would say write about how you feel. Well, let's talk about how we can increase the impact and understanding in our stories as we write our own, our family members' stories, and our ancestors' stories. But there comes with a warning. Every once in a while, it's going to require a little more research. So compelling stories include details that increase the emotional connection to the people you're writing about, if not the emotional impact of the story. A lot of that times that happens as we reveal our own connections to our characters, but it can also happen when we reveal our ancestors' vulnerabilities. Emotional context, which we'll look at examples of that, not only connect the readers to the characters and to the story, it leaves them more open to details. How many of us have read an article about something and we were so interested in it or so moved by it that we immediately started searching for more information? That's what our stories can do for the people that read them, which often might be our descendants, right? The details we share in our stories can also promote understanding of the circumstances behind the decisions family members and ancestors made. And these backdrops might explain how, for instance, a seaman from London could end up in landlocked Nebraska. They also might explain how a family rift happened. If we want our readers to properly understand our stories, we need to provide them with information that gives them reference points. And that definitely applies to the setting. We should give them clues and information about what is the historical, the social, and economic environment. Where did it take place? When did it take place? And they should also, our description should help bring the sensory environment to life. Not just what things looked like, but what it smelled like, what it felt like, what it sounded like. And the picture that you see here happens to be the home that my mother and her siblings grew up in. Sorry, that went the wrong way. Oh, in other words, we want to tell stories with context and circumstances. Accurate context helps stories evoke emotions and understanding. So again, this is connecting the readers with the characters in the stories. So context helps us to understand the opportunities they had, the limitations, and the obstacles they faced. Since I've thrown around that word context and circumstances, let's look at what that could entail. For instance, it could be the political climate, either world or regional or local. Religious traditions, and those might say what has to happen in what the future is going to look like for someone. Cultural traditions, educational opportunities, or the lack of those. And then there's also family context and circumstances. Birth order for a lot of our ancestors really spelled out a lot of what obstacles or opportunities there would be. The health or wealth of the family, are the individuals, their social standing. And then once again, you have the historical backdrop that could be global, national, regional, or even local. Because every community had its own little personality. Oh, in other words, we can highlight the decisions in light of circumstances. We don't just tell what happened. It's kind of the Paul Harvey effect. We're giving readers the rest of the story. Oh, if we're really lucky and we have enough information, we can tell readers not just what was going on in history, but how family members or ancestors or yourself, how did you react to what was going on in history? One thing that's really important for us to understand is that socio-historical context can change readers' outlook on the story, which when it comes to your descendants or descendants of the ancestors you're writing about, it can change the outlook they have on their own ancestry. And this is especially true when pop culture has taken some liberties with history, with the facts. We have all seen westerns where only the bad guys have bad teeth and the women's hair is always perfect and clean and the skin is unleathered by the sun. Or we can know that names weren't changed at Ellis Island. So this can be a really cool thing as we share our stories when we present facts and circumstances and give readers this wow moment. A great way to brainstorm, not just context, but exactly what are you going to do with all the facts that you have and how are you going to make them into a story, is to look at the person you want to write about and think about what else was happening. And my analogy from the picture is that these are layers of the onion. I don't know, that might have been too subtle. Here's a quick and dirty brainstorm timeline that I made for the first 20 years of my maternal grandmother's life. And I'm sure as you look at it, you see a lot of context, a lot of layers. My grandmother's birth, and she was only alive for a couple of days before her mother died. Shortly thereafter, her father remarried the same year the Wright brothers' plane took off. Not too long after that, she had a half brother born. I don't have a box for the year she was abandoned by her father, but it was about the time that World War I broke out. Right as she was 18, women won the right to vote. 2 years later, she got married in the same year that her grandmother who raised her died. So you can see there is tons of emotional and historical context. Starting out life with a mother, having a stepmother, having a half brother, all this stuff. Tons to write about, right? And just that one quick and dirty brainstorm can help you get started. But to give stories the correct impact, we need to sometimes explain the context, because our 21st century backdrops might make the stories harder to understand. For instance, when my great great uncle Buddy died, his wife, Carrie, remarried, and shortly thereafter, his 2 children ended up at an orphanage. I could tell you the context was West Virginia around 1908, but I'm not sure if you would get the correct implications of that. My distant cousin, who I recently made internet acquaintance, initially thought his great grandmother was heartless to give her children up just because she met a new man. But the truth of the matter was, at that time in West Virginia, a woman had 0 rights over her children if her husband wanted to give them up, even if he was not the biological father. So once we hear that, the potential of the story changes. And then I was able to the great grandson, I was able to reveal that my grandmother wrote about Carrie, and she wrote that she remarried a cruel man. So now we're thinking Carrie might be a co-victim here. And the other cool thing about doing this demonstrates that not all your stories have to be wrapped up and tied up with a pretty bow. Sometimes we can leave our readers with the mysteries that we're confronting ourselves. In addition to making stories more impactful, this kind of context can help when we just don't know much about our ancestors, but we want to be able to imagine what it would be like to know them. The woman on the far left of this photo is my paternal grandmother. Though she claimed throughout her life to have been orphaned at age 6, she didn't even remember her father's last name. She's seen here with her father and her siblings. Because she told us so many untruths, the only way I can grasp her past is understanding her circumstances, understanding her context. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's look at some sources of inspiration and context. How do we get started telling all these stories and writing them down? Well, of course, the biggest source of inspiration is research. So it's not just the facts that we found, but also the context that we found, and sometimes the context that we go after, because we want to know what would it have been like to live in that time, in that place. You have your memories. If it's your own stories and stories of your family, you have a lot of memories that can be sources of inspiration. Photo albums, scrapbooks, old film, ephemera, those are all great sources of inspiration. There are great stories in family heirlooms, for instance, something that's been passed down. And then there's oral histories that you can collect from family members, as well as family traditions. Although I will note that family traditions should either be listed as unconfirmed, or you should do a little research and make sure that they're right. Because sometimes they can make some left turns and be a little inaccurate, let's call it. When you are looking through photo albums and scrapbooks, make sure you look closely at the pictures for sparks of ideas for stories and for context. For instance, in this picture, I see that there is outdoor furniture in the house. Everyone's in shorts and they're tanned. So I assumed that this was a family reunion out at a lake outside of Grand Rapids. And it's also interesting for me to see that the mirror on the wall is actually a mirror that is now in my own house. So this tells me where it started its life and how I ended up with it. Clothing can give you great clues. It can tell you what the occasion was. It can narrow a date down. It can tell you what the weather was. And sometimes there will even be, like in this photo on the right, where my wedding outfit was listed. This was in a found photo album that I was trying to identify the people, so I don't know which of the ladies wrote that. The photos, the clothing can also give you an indication of socioeconomics. This is a photo of the school where my mother and her siblings went. It was taken mid to late 30s, and I can glean a lot. But looking at my Uncle Joe, who is the second from the left on the front row, it tells me a lot about his family. Because Uncle Joe went to school with no shoes? That leads me to a lot of questions and a lot of things to understand. Other clues include technology. Again, that can date a photo, especially with vehicles, and that can have great stories if you compare the technology with the technology we have today. There are cultural and faith clues that we can get in photographs and scrapbooks. Architecture of a church building can give you a hint about the denomination, or things that are in the background can give you tips about the people and where they were. There are a lot of times some great emotional clues in the facial expression and body languages. These two photos that you see are both of my mother on the same Christmas morning. And you can see in the photo on the left, she was quite pleased to get a gift of clothing, and that she was less than thrilled with her new casserole dish. And that actually reminds me that there is a story that Mom believed that if it had to do with cooking and cleaning, it was not a gift. When you see people in photos, friends, neighbors, etc., that don't fit in the family tree, don't necessarily just ignore them. They might have a relationship to what went on in your family dynamic. When I scanned some old films from when I was 1 year old, I found an older boy in many of our family scenes. I don't have a brother. It took me a while, and then I remembered that my parents were raising their girls far, far away from family. So friends fulfilled that function. And the little boy was their best friend's son. So when Laura learned to walk, of course they called Bill over to see what was happening. He was like family. And of course, if you have the luxury of having family around to ask questions, you should. If they're household members, you could do it by just casually going through photos together. If it's a family member that lives far away and you don't see them very often, you might want to set up kind of an appointment to sit down and record some memories. So, AKA an oral history interview. Also, you look for animal stories. The horse on the right, in the photo on the right, was a beloved family member in my mom's family named Morgan. And this photo was such a gift because as my aunt suffered from dementia and Alzheimer's, she really could not talk about anything recent. But I could always sit down and get a good Morgan story out of my aunt. So it was so cool to have the photos with the animals to ask her about. Aunt Nancy, was Morgan your horse? What about Bob? And she tells me. Another thing I feel that people do that is maybe a little bit of a mistake is they ignore photos that don't have people. And honestly, I don't take a lot of photos. Well, I do take a lot of photos without people, but they normally have animals. I don't take a lot of photos of objects. But if the photographer is still around, it's really cool to ask them, what was significant about this? Why did you take this photo? Why was that furnace that looks like an octopus? Why was it interesting to you? This could lead you to some great stories. If you're like me, you might not have access to very many family members to interview. I am down to one uncle who is 92. And so what do you do then? Well, one great thing is to approach genealogical and historical societies in the area where the photos were taken and ask them for help. This photo was of my grandma and grandpa, and I thought maybe it was their honeymoon, and I thought maybe it was Pittsylvania County, Virginia. So I went on Facebook to the Pittsylvania County Genealogical Society's Facebook group, and I asked them, do you recognize this backdrop? And what I did get from them was that it absolutely is not anywhere in Pennsylvania County. And so they gave me some advice of where I might try. Of course, to look for records about those people, and then you might find things that explain where they were, where they lived, etc. Memory is a temperamental and fallible faculty, but there are a few things you can do to improve recall. And to understand how that works, we need to look for a moment at how memory works. So we'll do a Cliff Notes style explanation of what scientists call episodic or autobiographical memory and how it's stored. Because our ability to retrieve memories really comes from the way the brain stores them. So part of the wonder of our brains is that it doesn't store memories of events like they would on a card catalog or a memory disk. For instance, riding a horse on a sunny day isn't in a specific place in your brain. The brain stores individual pieces of context, like the feel of the horse underneath you, the sun at your back, the sound of the leather saddle, the whinnying of the horse, the beauty of your surroundings, and so forth. All those little pieces of context are stored in separate locations. However, they're encoded together. What that means then is each little individual piece of context becomes interrelated with the other ones. So each one of those things can be a memory cue. And because they're encoded together, that one cue can bring back the full memory. So that makes sense if you think about how you're somewhere and you smell something that you haven't smelled for years, and suddenly memories come rushing back. You maybe go to a horse farm and suddenly you remember that horse ride. Those memories come back because our brain's experiencing the same or a similar set of sensory cues as it had at the time those memories were stored. And in addition, our emotions can play an important role in explaining why we remember some things and not others. Basically, the more emotionally significant the event is, the more likely we are to recall it. For instance, I still remember the day I learned to ride my bike and the wind in my hair and turning and seeing my dad was no longer behind me pushing. I have no clue when my sister learned to ride a bike. Maybe it's cold-hearted, but it apparently was not important to me at the time. Oh, so we go back to our horseback riding analogy. If the horseback ride was a boring little pony ride that went in circles, we're not that apt to remember it. But if we were terrified of horses and someone made you ride it and you were clinging on for dear life, you're going to remember it. If you loved it and it was the best thing you ever did in your life, you're going to remember it. So we put those sensory and emotional context together, and it tells us how the memories were stored and maybe gives us a few clues on what we can do to increase our recall. So our takeaway is to tune into your five senses as you think back. Even better would be if you can immerse yourself in a sensory-rich environment as you brainstorm. If you're trying to remember what life was, a beach trip, go to the shore if you can. If you can go back to the exact place, that would be ideal. A lot of us can't do that, but do give yourself the benefit of retrieving that sensory information. Oh, also, don't overlook your own stories. First person narratives and family histories are important historical documents. John Bond, who wrote The Story of You, a guide for writing your personal stories and family history, that says, you are doing a service by leaving a legacy, no matter how small or large. A lot of us wonder, though, are my stories interesting enough, exciting enough, different enough? I don't know if you've wondered, but I have. But looking at best-selling memoirs, we see that it's not about being extraordinary. That universal experiences connect, especially with people who have felt those same emotions, that have experienced grief, faced hardship, overcome obstacles. Those stories are completely universal, and people want to read them. Here's two more quotes that I thought were very interesting, and it kind of brings us back around to putting yourself in the story, whether you're the star of it or not. Don't step outside of your story and simply talk about it. Stand inside of it and live it again. So that kind of reinforces going back to the sensory environment, and it helps you enjoy the writing project because you're just re-experiencing what happened. And then Stuart Cummings says it's emotions, not words, that make a story a story. We're going to use words to convey those emotions, but we're not just stating the facts. And then don't forget that your research journey is part of the story. There are some great stories about how hard people worked to figure out what happened to their great-grandparents, or what happened to how this family secret came about, etc. Oh, how do we stay on track? Sometimes looking at the stories that we have to tell and to share, that can be intimidating. It's almost like looking at 26.2 miles when you're a marathoner that's just starting out. But marathoners learn just to look at the mile in front of them. And we should do the same. Think of writing your stories as a project that's in process. It's a work in process. It's small pieces, something that you enjoy coming back to again and again, like your family history research or dessert. And then my best advice is don't expect your first draft to be perfect. Just write it. You can clean it up in the editing stage. Focus on the stories, not self-critique. And I will add, everybody does have to edit, so you can do that later. So there's three things that can help us develop our ideas for our stories. One is an idea bank. Then if you're like me, you have piles of scrap paper and backs of envelopes and receipts and sundry handouts where you've jotted down ideas. An idea bank is simply a system for that, a designated place for keeping up with passing thoughts and ideas so you can come back to them regularly. Whether you use a paper notebook or an electronic one, have some system to be able to keep track with ideas that you have. You can also think of this as a nursery of sort. It's a place for ideas to grow and develop roots. In fact, this might even be a better way to think of it, since you're not trying to accumulate a life savings, but rather nurture ideas and stories. You're probably all familiar with brainstorming. This is just your gentle reminder that brainstorming is also not the time or place for self-editing. Spelling checks, full grammatical sentences, none of those things count. The idea is to regurgitate something out of your brain and get it on paper. Evaluating those ideas will come later. Mind maps are kind of like brainstorms on steroids. They're visual thinking tools that help you represent ideas graphically and see the relationships between thoughts. You may have seen this in research. This is one I had of a very far back ancestor when I was just trying to wrap my brain about how the different British monarchies and the dissolution of the monasteries affected their lives. But I also have done one for my grandmother's grandpa and looking at all the different kinds of stories that she wrote about him and how I might write about it. One of the common questions I get is, how do I publish my stories? What are my options? Well, you have long form options like a complete family history or a complete autobiography or a memoir. Short form options are just vignettes that you write or collections of stories, ancestor profiles. And there are also creative forms like scrapbooks and journals and photo displays. I am pretty sure this link is in your handout. If you want to read more about that, this is a link from my website where there's a whole article about how to publish your memories and stories. So tell your stories. Tell them about even the ancestors that don't have the equivalent to flashy feathers, the plain ones. Not all of our ancestors were exotic types that crossed the oceans, and not all of them were endowed with military prowess, and only a few at best are verified patriots, are original settlers. But all these stories matter, even the homesteaders, the family members that kept up with the children, the ones that tended the garden and the farm. We might have family members and ancestors who made their living from the sea. When you write about yourself and the people in your family and your ancestors, you, the family historian, has a unique power to connect others to your family tree. And if you forgive my metaphor, you're making it the beloved shade tree in the middle of the backyard, the one that all the adults sit under, the one that the kids climb. So your stories actually can act as boards that make it easier to climb and make it a fun place, almost like you'd added a tire swing. Oh. With that, I'd like to thank you for your interest and your attention, and I will turn it back over to Jade. And if there's any questions, I would be happy to answer them. You'll see my contact information and my website links on your handout as well.
Thank you, Laura. Everyone, I've posted the link for Laura's site as well as the link for the handouts in the comments. I've also posted a question for the audience. I'll show that now. What inspired you to begin your family's story? Tell us in the comments, and the first responder gets a signed Memories of Me book by Laura. Okay, and Laura, if you want to answer the question and tell the audience what inspired you to first begin your family history story, just to get the ball rolling?
I was inspired because my grandmother did it. She wrote in secret all her life. And she inspired the book, which is a guide to how to write. It's kind of like a roadmap. It's not do it this way, there's only one right way to write your stories, but it's a guide to sharing and telling the stories of your life. And she did not want her stories published. But somehow I felt like the bigger thing to pass on is how to use narratives to connect families across generations, because I think I'm more connected to her in some ways as an older person, even though she's been gone, than I was in life when she was very much in a grandma box.
Okay. We got a response from Leanne. Leanne was inspired by her grandmother.
Cool, something in common.
Leanne, I will message you, and I will message you where to pick it up and everything, so you'll be hearing from me. We got another response from Elizabeth. Immigration stories of my family and me, because I was so young. Well, my grandmother and grandfather, all of their stories inspired me to look deeper into my family history and their stories as well. So we have things in common.
Yes.
All right. Everyone, if you want to keep responding, you can. And if you want to reach out to Laura, again, the link to her handouts and her contact information is in the comments. It should be the first comment. So, all right, Laura, thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Well, I hope it was helpful to people. I'm really passionate about it, and I can tell you that it is worthwhile to connect through the stories. It's sometimes a little bit of work, but it's very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Jade. I appreciate it.
Thank you. See you, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.